As I'm sure most of you know, I train using a full body split. I think all else being equal, that's probably the best split for most people if progress is the goal. However, if pure enjoyment was the goal, then personally, push-pull legs is probably going to win it for me. And as my priorities change, I can certainly see myself switching back to PPL at some point. Now, from time to time, I do go off plan and treat myself to a dedicated leg day purely for enjoyment. Usually that still has to be within the context of my training week, but let's say it wasn't. Let's say it was just a standalone leg workout and we didn't have to consider any fatigue, recovery or weekly volume related to any other workouts. How would it then look? Let's find out. I'm not one for hugely excessive warm-ups, but I do think for legs it's important to be more thorough because you're going to be shifting some relatively heavy weight, using your knees, which you definitely don't want to injure, and potentially loading some weight onto your back as well. How much warming up you need to do is pretty individual and also depends on basic things like temperature in your gym or whether you drove or walked there. My go-to is walking lunges, and I like these because you can adjust things like your stride length and depth as you get warmer, and you can also pause in a nice stretch position where you're getting a good glute, quad and partial hamstring stretch on one side whilst opening up your hip flexors on the other side. They're also a good precursor to what's going to be my first exercise. No points for guessing what that's going to be. I also then like to do some bodyweight RDLs just to get a bit more hamstring and posterior chain activity in there. Exercise number 1 is Bulgarian split squats. Although we've already done some warming up, I'll still start with some bodyweight sets just to get used to the extra depth that you get with these over walking lunges and also to mark out my foot placement. Standing on a plate will help to achieve a greater range of motion, but I'd certainly reserve that for when you have some more experience with the exercise. As a general rule, your most fatiguing exercise should come first in your workout, so you would usually be starting a leg workout with your leg press type movement. I don't think I need to talk about this exercise too much because I've covered it a lot, but in summary, the reason that I think this is the best leg press type movement is a combination of the range of motion achievable, the ease of maintaining a neutral spine, and the fact that it's unilateral. Essentially, I think it has the best, or at least the joint best, mechanics of all exercises in its category. There is a bit of a learning curve. People have trouble getting the right setup and being able to balance, but I think it's worth the time it takes to get right. Now, I prefer using a barbell over holding dumbbells because then I just have one weight to stabilize rather than two, and I'm also not expending energy with my grip or traps. You can practice these in a Smith machine or even just stick solely to Smith machine and it's probably almost as good. Usually I would order exercises from most to least fatiguing. However, I think it makes sense to break that order where you're considering the crossover fatigue from one exercise to another. So where a lot of people might put leg extensions next, I'm not, because I just worked my quads pretty hard in my previous exercise. I'm going to go with my first of 2 calf exercises here. And for this, I'm doing a standing Smith machine calf press using a ramp under my feet to give some extra range of motion. You could use a calf press machine, but I like to be able to rest at the bottom of the rep because if I have my feet on a ledge, I sometimes get cramp in the bridge of my foot. And this pause also stops you bouncing back up and relying on the muscle's elasticity to do half the rep for you. There are 2 muscles you need to think about when training the calves, the gastrocnemius and the soleus. The gastroc is what you typically recognize as the calf muscle because it's superficial, i.e. on the outside, it's the one you can see. And the soleus runs underneath it, so although you can't really see it, making it bigger will still increase the thickness of your calves overall. Straight leg calf raises do work both, but usually when both are working, your gastroc takes up most of the strain, and I'll talk about why seated work the soleus more when we come to them later. Next up, I'm going for the seated hamstring curl. I think hamstring isolation is pretty much essential, and if you're only going to do one, it should probably be seated. Studies have compared lying hamstring curls to seated directly and found seated to result in greater hypertrophy. It's thought that this is probably because the hamstrings are working whilst in a more stretched position, which is because as well as being knee flexors, they're also hip extensors, so when the hip is flexed, then they're under more tension. Next up, leg extension. By now, quads should have had a nice rest since the split squats. You'll see I'm using a plate-loaded machine that allows me to manipulate the resistance curve by placing plates on different pins. Now, I'm not going to go into that because I think the majority of people probably don't have access to such a machine, and your typical weight stack leg extension machine is perfectly fine. I don't think I have to justify the inclusion of leg extension, but I think I will in case anyone is interested because I do actually think it's quite interesting. Firstly, think about what you don't get from a leg press type movement. Those exercises typically get easier the closer you get to lockout. So your quads are working really hard when they're extended, but really not that hard once they're anywhere close to flexed, and zero when they're fully flexed, or what you would say is locked out. A leg extension kind of fills this gap because it enables your quads to work hard even when fully flexed at the top of the leg extension. So although you might achieve a similar range of motion at the knee on both exercises, the range of motion for which you encounter significant resistance is usually actually better on the leg extension. Another point is that your rectus femoris, one of your 4 quad muscles, originates on your pelvis, which means that as you squat or leg press, even though it's shortening at one end, the knee, it's actually lengthening at the other end, the pelvis, which ultimately means it's not particularly active during your leg press movement, as it's the other 3 muscles that take up a lot of the slack. Therefore, if we do want to work this muscle, which we do because we want to work them all, obviously, we have to include some leg extensions, and there are studies to support this. Finally, even for those muscles that do grow significantly from both leg extensions and squat type movements, there have been studies showing different proportions of regional hypertrophy. That's another rabbit hole that I'm just going to sidestep completely, but the overall conclusion is this, right? Do a leg press type movement and a leg extension for maximum overall hypertrophy of the quads. Now for our second calf isolation movement, we're going to do some seated calf raises, and the reason these will target the soleus more is because the gastroc becomes somewhat deactivated due to the knee flexion. Deactivated probably isn't the scientifically correct term there, it's certainly less active, right? So the gastroc crosses both joints, which means that flexing the knee shortens it significantly, reducing the tension, shifting emphasis onto the soleus. Although equally disgusting, you will feel quite a different sensation when you're doing straight leg calf raises versus bent leg calf raises. Finally, we're going to finish off on some hyperextensions. I personally just do body weight, but you can add weight if you really want to. These will work your glutes and hamstrings, and you'll likely feel them in your erectors as well, just from maintaining that isometric contraction. That being said, I'm not really doing these for aesthetic purposes. I just think they're a great exercise, more for strengthening your posterior chain. I think it would be remiss of us not to include a hip hinge of some sort. The reason I'm choosing this hyperextension bench is because it's probably the best single resistance curve, right? If you have to choose one, emphasis on if you have to choose one hip hinge. So that's pretty much the workout. I'm just going to put it on the screen so you can see it all in one place. And as you can see, like I mentioned earlier, I have tried to split up those exercises such that the fatigue going from one to the next isn't too great. So I haven't got my leg extension work next to my leg press type work. I haven't got my hyperextensions next to my hamstring curls, and I've split up my calf work as well. Let's move on to a final important point that I want to make. The problem with perfect workouts. So I basically try to create the perfect leg workout in a vacuum without the context of broader training considerations, but really you're still forced to make some compromises. Let's look at that last exercise. I actually don't think this is the single best hip hinge movement. For that, I'd probably say it's a Romanian deadlift. But the reason I didn't put Romanian deadlifts in this workout is because I think it'd probably be too much when you factor in all the other work you're doing. RDLs are quite taxing, and so in an ideal world, I probably wouldn't put them in the same workout as Bulgarian split squats, which is another really taxing exercise. In an ideal world, I'd probably have 2 different leg workouts. In one, I would probably do Bulgarian split squats and hyperextensions, and in the other, I'd probably do a less taxing and certainly less time consuming leg press type movement, like an actual leg press machine, for example, and I'd do RDLs in that workout. In fact, I would ditch this hyperextension bench altogether in favour of this one, because I think if you look at the resistance curve for this bench, it's steep ascending, right? It gets harder the closer you get to the top, and I think that couples perfectly with RDLs, which are essentially the opposite. They are steep descending. They get easier as you get closer to peak contraction. I only chose this hyperextension bench for this workout because it probably has the best of both worlds, but it's certainly not as good as combining these two. If I did have the option of 2 leg workouts, I'd also likely split up my calf work, and depending on the individual and their training focus, you might want to incorporate some kind of hip thrusts in there as well, and there are probably other changes I'd make too. So this leads me to 2 main final points. 1, if you can only do 1 leg workout, probably do the one I gave or something similar. And 2, the perfect leg workout, or perfect anything workout, is a kind of fun exercise, but it's almost, in a sense, it doesn't exist, because it's impossible to talk about these things without a broader context. Now, this doesn't mean we can't give helpful, broad recommendations that have a high probability of being the best option for the most people, but it does mean that we have to take everything with a grain of salt and ask, is this right for me? I hope that helps. Anyway, if you'd like me to do more of these perfect workout type videos, let me know. To be honest, I'll probably ignore what everyone says and just do it based on whether it gets sick views or not. Alright, see you later. I wasn't very funny in that video, sorry about that, I was a bit serious. Alright, see you later.
Jordy Lenny is my hero!